Well, this sure is a bit different, James commented, as they stepped out onto Net Narrator station. Admittedly, he had not been to that many space stations yet, and those hadn't even been that similar to each other, considering who was in control of them. But this one still managed to feel almost completely unlike those others, even if it was technically also just a huge ring floating in space, like any other station would be. The first big difference was the colour scheme, as everything here was made from darker materials, making the station itself also seem darker by extension. The ground and most walls were coloured in slightly different shades of onyx, just unlike each other enough to differentiate between the two, while still giving it a uniform feeling. However, to combat some of the darkness, light sources have been integrated at every possible spot, shining a pure white light out into the room. And although it could have been easily left at that, whoever designed this place seemed to have had some fun with it, because it seemed that the lights along the floor and walls often had some form of gimmick integrated into them, whenever their placement would allow for it. Often, they were used as markers or signposts, indicating which way you were going, that followed you as you walked. The straight lines of light folding into letters and symbols, right before your eyes, when some mechanism in the ground detected your presence. When walking up to the station-typical suspended walkways, they were supposed to be used, separated by size. The ground even gave it its best shot to tell you which of the walkways you should probably use based on your weight, although the process wasn't perfect, and the humans and Miet's density led to the ground to assume that they were a lot larger than they actually were, leading it to recommend a walkway to them that was a couple of sizes too large. Still, the attempt by itself was kind of cute, found James, and so was that, whenever there wasn't such a practical use for the light, the creators really did seem to just have fun with it. One wall, for example, simply copied your silhouette with bright dots as you walked past it. Another had a swirling wave of light follow you that danced along like leaves caught in the wind. There was no real reason for it, seemingly, and James didn't even want to imagine the amount of planning, engineering, and especially maintenance that went into all of this for so little benefit in the end. But it was very pretty. Yeah, though I kind of find it hard to believe that the primates picked a place like this to hold their conference, Sheeta replied as she walked along with him, a shadow of light currently following after her along the ground. Pretty as it is, this station basically screams Lakshazet. Given the current climate, picking a Deathworld-operated station as their venue is kind of odd. But maybe they really were attracted by how modern this place is. Then again, the Lakshazet always had a sort of unique standing with the community, even as Deathworlders. Using his memory training he had done back on Earth, James rummaged through the back of his mind. The Lakshazet had introduced a lot of technology to the community over the years. They even had a major part in designing the modern ship designs that the community was still using to this day. It's something to keep in mind, I guess, James admitted, as he glanced around at the sparking all around him that followed all kinds of people as they went about their day on this station. It really was quite packed here, much like they had anticipated based on the number of public events that would be taking place here in very close proximity to each other, both space and time-wise. Though, so far, the specific part of the station that they were traversing now did seem to pull in mostly a specific clientele of people, namely Deathworlders. Way more than James had ever seen in one place, with the exception of their own homeworlds, of course. Naturally, it wasn't just Deathworlders walking around this area of the station, but the amount of them was still absolutely noteworthy. Then again, James remembered that, back on the GCS, most normal people also tended to avoid the area around the Rushgak hive, deciding to steer clear of the Deathworlders whenever they could. As they were heading towards one of those very hives right now, maybe none of this was all that strange. Arriving at their destination, James wasn't sure if it was funny or a relief to see that at least the insectoids had, even in this place, stuck to the way of building their hives that he was used to from previous experiences. Spreading out across a pretty enormous open area of the station, the hive structure grew out of the metal ground. Taking a set of stairs up on top of it, following colourful labelled lines on the ground would lead them to their destinations, as the densely stacked rooms that many trapdoor-like entrances were leading into could barely be distinguished from the outside otherwise. As they walked along the structure's roof, following the green line that was labelled with registration, the group could watch quite the buzz going on around the hive, as Rushgak workers were quickly skitting around all over the place, hurrying from room to room, often while carrying either a tray or some sort of crate with them in the process. Admittedly, his frame of reference was beyond small, but this was still the busiest James had ever seen a Rushgak hive being, and based on stories he had been told before, it was rather unusual to see one this densely used. "Let's hope our reservations went through," Admir mumble-chuckled for his breath filter, as he too looked around at the busy goings-on around them. The group sort of chuckled along with him, as they approached the end of the green line, and soon they followed it down another set of stairs into the registration area, where a single Rushgak worker was busily working away at a computer terminal behind a large counter. Immediately, 4 whole people tried to push themselves past James, as Shida, Nia, Athena and Admir all immediately volunteered to take over the checking-in process for him. However, James stopped them all with extended arms. Then, he halted for a moment, taking a deep breath. "I got this," he told himself, then took another deep breath, and then he moved towards the receptionist. "Hello there," he greeted the insectoid, as he got into a conversational distance with them. The workers stopped their typing on their terminal and looked up at him with their 4 pairs of compound eyes, their head constantly moving in erratic twitches, before seemingly pausing entirely for a second as they saw him. Seeing as he apparently wasn't asked to wait a moment longer while they finished something, James continued, "We've made reservations for rooms under the name Aldwin. Would it be possible to check us in real quick?" "So far so good," he told himself, despite the nervously beating heart in his chest. Even to him, it was almost incredible that he somehow could go through all the things that had happened to him in just the last year, and still somehow be nervous about talking to a receptionist. "Right, one moment," the worker announced, sounding almost hesitant as they began to look at their terminal again, swiping away their previous work and opening a new window, most likely checking for the mentioned registration. And then, that went on for some time, with the worker typing away at their computer continuously for what felt like minutes. This, of course, did not in any way help James's anxiety, as Admir's earlier joke came to mind again. Was there a way their reservation really hadn't come through somehow? James shook his head. That was just his damn brain talking. This place was very busy right now, so of course things would take a bit longer, and he swallowed any notion that said otherwise down. "It's all in your head," he told himself, which helped at first, until he noticed that he wasn't the only one getting angsty at some point. In his periphery, he could see the rest of his team shift their weight in place and glance around, their body language telling him that they were also slowly starting to wonder what exactly was taking so long. Not in my head, James then thought, all of his previous resolve breaking down almost instantly. Definitely not in my head. And almost as soon as he thought that, the doorway above them was suddenly blocked by approaching forms, as a small procession of Rushgak consisting of, concerningly, 4 soldiers, and a kind of the insectoids that James hadn't seen before. However, based on their size alone, he presumed it was either some form of super major, or maybe some higher ranking kind akin to a king, that entered the reception area. Basically jumping into action, James's team formed up between the insectoids and their civilian company, hands twitching onto their weapons as they faced down the ominous arrivals. The smaller-bodied insectoids immediately stopped, briefly fluttering their leathery wings, while allowing the lone giant to step further forwards, approaching the primates. "Ambassador Aldwyn," the king greeted, looking past the soldiers in front of him right at James, his shear-like mandibles twitching wildly as he spoke. The grabbing claws at the end of his long, foremost legs fiddled with each other almost nervously. "We didn't expect you." Indicating for his own guards to step aside as well, James approached the large insectoid, causing the soldier classes behind him to let out concerned chitters, as they lacked the vocal organs to communicate in the common language. James wasn't quite sure why they would have been expected or not expected, and given that he was still influenced more than just a little by his earlier anxiety, especially now that one of his worst fears had seemingly come true, the only thing he could think to reply was, "Well, we, made reservations?" The large Rushgak tilted their head for a moment, as if confused, but quickly caught themselves again with a flutter of their colourful wings. Quickly they looked up at their worker behind the counter, who presumably gave them some sort of confirming sign, even if James couldn't see it. "Certainly," they then said, with another nervous twitch of their mandibles, briefly rubbing one grasper along the mouthparts to calm them. "But that is not what I was referring to. You. They seemed to struggle for a second, presumably seeking for the most polite way to express whatever they were going to tell them here. Ultimately, it was their soldiers who took the words out of their mouth. Although the burly insectoids couldn't vocally speak in GU, that didn't exactly keep them from signing their thoughts as they faced James, and almost in unison they informed him, "You weren't invited." James's expression shifted to a taken-aback one at that information. The king quickly glanced around, only now noticing that their soldiers had become part of the conversation, and they chittered at them, seemingly displeased. James scratched along his neck and used the opportunity of distraction to quickly look at his company, who could do little more than shrug back at him, while remaining quiet to let them handle it themselves. "I'm, pretty sure I was," he informed loudly, breaking up the chittering argument between the Rushgak, as they quickly twitched to look back at him. Even had it confirmed to me multiple times during the registration process. Briefly glancing around between his soldiers and the sole worker on the other side of the room, the king's hands once again reached their mandibles, before gliding along short antennae on their head. "I think we'd know if you were. We are hosting the event," they then announced, after a moment of seemingly steeling themselves. For a moment, James could basically hear both of their thought processes come to a crashing halt, as they all realised that they must be missing something here at the same time, and he quickly raised his hands to stop everything. "We should probably clarify what we are talking about here," he quickly said in a firm voice. "I highly doubt you are hosting the Conference of the Primate Order, which I was invited to." The Rushgak shifted their heads slightly, before seemingly deflating in a long exhale of understanding. "You are not here for the Council of Deathworlders?" They asked for clarification, though already seeming relieved. "No," James replied with a shake of his head. "Monkey business." In response, the insectoid released a long chitter that seemed to be more akin to a sigh than actual words, before looking up and addressing their worker with a long string of words in their native language. As they spoke, their soldiers already turned to leave the room again. Finally, they looked at James again. "Forgive us for the misunderstanding," they announced, before also turning and leaving the reception area, without further explanation. Then, suddenly, as if nothing had happened, the worker behind James spoke up again. "Your rooms are ready for you, sir." "So, do we by chance know about any other human vessels that have recently departed for this area?" James casually asked, as they walked over the structure towards their room after registration had been finished. "Nope," Admir replied, popping the P loudly in the process while folding his hands behind his head. As far as we're aware, humanity just hasn't been invited to this Council of Deathworlders at all. Probably an image thing, given the current situation. James nodded along, figuring the same. It was a shame, obviously, as humanity was basically at the forefront of addressing Deathworlder rights. However, he also understood that directly associating with them right now was not the best path to take for one's reputation, which was also why he'd been so confused about being invited to the Primate Conference in the first place. He sighed. Alright, everyone. Let's check our rooms collectively. After that, we can take 5 before we... James started to announce, after turning to his group. However, as he spoke, their gazes were all gradually wandering upwards, and he could feel the ground slightly shake as something was approaching from behind him. Usually, that much wouldn't have been that weird. He had seen many people in a size range that would allow for that walking around the place, even while just glancing around. However, once he started to notice that even Moore and Conglorge were slowly starting to turn their gazes upwards, his words stopped as a queasy feeling was gradually taking hold of his stomach. Because, so far, there was only one species in his mind that usually had that effect when it approached. As everyone else was basically already cranking their heads all the way back into their necks as they stared up at whoever was approaching there, James momentarily stilled himself for the sight that might await him once he turned around, clenching his fists and holding in a lung full of air. Then he quickly turned, deciding to just get it over with, and already he was more than prepared to dodge an unwarranted trunk heading for his head if necessary. However, as he turned, he was then swiftly surprised to not find himself face to face with the horrific, many-eyed visage of a massive Zodatios. Instead, what he saw behind him, there was, well, not quite as large as the largest sapient species. However, they were still standing at least a good measure taller than both Moore and Conglorge as they peered down at him. The Tonastrosite almost immediately gave the being a respectful bow of his head, his demeanour indicating that the place between this being's people and the Tonostrosites had been more than clearly determined in the past. Still, despite their size, their face was still a lot, for a lack of a better term, friendlier than that of one of the titanic elephants. It was long and narrow, with 3 pairs of nostrils, 2 in the front of their snout and 1 further up, closer to their large, perfectly round and tar-black eyes. Their skin was dark like ebony, and long pointed ears with 2 flaps hung off the side of their head lazily, although their stiffness seemed to indicate that they could clearly be stood up if so desired. Wandering along their body with his gaze, James could see that they had 6 legs. The 2 they were standing on were massive, with extremely wide 3-clawed feet. 2 more formed their arms that ended in clearly dexterous 6-fingered hands. Meanwhile, the 2 foremost legs were reformed into what looked like enormous shovel-like digging appendages, which, when not in use, seemed to be repurposed as a sort of shield, formed by its enormous unified claws, protecting their breast and underbelly, while resting on top of them. Most of the rest of their body, but especially their back, was covered in thick, overlapping scales that were very dark red in colour. At the end of their body, a flat tail was curled up along its length, the scales giving it an almost pinecone-like appearance. James blinked twice as he took in the entire picture slowly. This was a Ligomordular, the only Deathworlder hailing from a planet with the classification of Class 5. For a moment, the 2 high-class Deathworlders held silent eye contact with each other. Well, James did anyway, as his own eyes were of course obscured by his breath filter. Then, finally, he found his voice again in front of the Colossus. "Hello there," he greeted, after a clearing of his throat, and stood up a bit straighter, crossing his arms behind his back. Can I help you?" Admittedly, James was unsure of what to expect from the being before him, as outward information on Ligomordular was sparse compared to even many other Deathworlders. All he knew was that the planet they hailed from was unforgiving, and that they had now used their position as the highest class to take up a sort of leadership position in the current endeavours of the Deathworlders. The massive creature paused for a moment, with all 6 of their nostrils flaring as they seemingly took in his scent. Then, they erupted in a loud, no, absolutely thunderous laugh, their voice booming so loudly that James and the other humans could feel it resonating in their chests, while Sheeta twitched to cover her ears from the noise. "I must say, I should have expected this," the massive being then announced, seemingly more to themselves than to their company. "Of course you would find your way here, but I must admit I didn't think you would be quite so brazen." James had flinched ever so slightly at the sudden outburst, and was now straightening himself up again, while trying to keep his composure in front of the jovially enthusiastic Colossus. "Brazen?" he asked, and once again cleared his throat while looking basically straight up at the man. "I believe there might be a misunderstanding." The Ligomordular laughed again, even if less loudly this time. Of course, they announced between chuckles. "You are here for other business. I see you. Well, as long as you behave, I obviously cannot tell you what to do with your time, but, They paused for a second, as they started to lean down, and taking a few steps back while supporting their weight with their enormous digging claws, they peeled away from their chest for a second, as they brought their enormous head closer to James. "You understand that I can't just let you do as you please, right? This council needs some legitimacy, and that means we can't just let people walk all over us during our first official meeting. You understand?" They continued, with a slightly lowered voice. James tilted his head at the man, unsure if he was trying to intimidate him, or if the giant's body language was simply skewed a bit by the size difference. "Of course," James replied firmly, not moving to back down from the armoured person one bit. "We have no intentions of intruding on your conference uninvited. We simply happen to book rooms here as well by coincidence. A little tip for the future. Maybe make sure that can't happen next time by telling your venue to go invite-only for a couple of days." The Ligomordular hummed in what sounded like mild displeasure. However, as they had said themselves, as long as James behaved, there was really no reason for them to react to his presence in any way. As they regarded each other once more, much quieter footsteps also approached them. Turning his gaze briefly to make sure whoever approached them was safe, James saw 2 bipedal vulpines, with deep green eyes and massive ears, walk towards them. Thick, bushy tails swayed behind them as they walked. And, to James's surprise, they were clad in loose grey aprons, at least somewhat covering most of their body, although they still wouldn't quite count as fully clothed. What, however, surprised him even more than that was that one of them was augmented. One side of their face showed the typical deep green eye. However, the other side was half covered in a rust-red metal plate, in the centre of which a yellow eye replacement could be seen staring back at them. The metal was polished to a mirror sheen, and glimmered in the station's light, while the natural and artificial eye seemed to try and find James's somewhere underneath his mask. Meanwhile, their companions' eyes were going right past James, and they immediately zeroed in on Sheeta, with their expression becoming a mixture of aghast on hesitantly curious. James didn't quite dare to make assumptions about why exactly the strange vulpine would have such a reaction to his girlfriend. However, the deep scars of claw marks running along their chest and neck did give him some ideas. And those eyes seemed a bit too wide to him for it to be just a loose connection to the same species. However, after a few seconds, the Lakshasette collectively tore their eyes away from the human procession, and instead swiftly approached the massive Ligomordular. "It's time to test the sound systems," the one with the artificial eye announced with a high voice. as they looked up at him. "We need you as a reference." The Colossus mildly chuckled again. "Right away," they said, as they pushed themselves back to their full height. Looking back at James, they then announced, "Until another time, Ambassador. Success to you." "Goodbye," James replied with a nod of his head, and he watched on as his fellow Deathworlders moved away to what was presumably the Hive's conference room. As they went, the mechanical-eyed Vulpin momentarily turned back to look at him one more time, while the others seemed determined to keep the gaze away from Shida to the best of their ability. "Yeesh," a voice from his side then commented, ripping James from his thoughts as Coco walked up to him. "What's their deal?" "Don't ask that," James replied, after a long exhale, and he briefly glanced back at Shida, who had a concerned look on her face, as her ears slightly hung down while she watched after the leaving Vulpin. "I'm afraid we might find out." "Wow, brings back memories, huh?" Shida commented, as she and James finally stepped into their once again temporary domain. "I didn't think it would look this much alike." James kind of had to agree. Given how different the stations around them were, he too had somewhat expected the insides of the hives to be pretty different as well. However, from the golden honey-yellow walls, floor and ceiling, over the luxurious yet human-sized furniture, with the exception of the extremely oversized bed, all the way to the single large door leading towards the bathroom, it all looked the same. Hopefully, behind it, the same kind of swimming pool-sized bathtub would be waiting for them as well. "I'll try to let it only bring back the positive ones," James commented, as he deposited his luggage into the corner, already pondering if he would unpack it later, or if he would just be living out of his suitcase for the time of their stay. Shida, already in the process of throwing herself onto the massive bed, stopped for a moment and turned her head towards him, her ears standing up attentively. "What? Are you saying that night wasn't memorable enough?" she asked in a slightly teasing tone, and her ears flicked suggestively. "I'm saying a lot happened that day," James replied, and briefly allowed his mechanical arm to make some inhuman, snake-like movements as he reached to scratch his back for a moment, indicating at least one other event this place could theoretically bring back memories of. Shida, having apparently rethought her idea of jumping onto the bed in a wide arch, instead turned around and sat down on its edge, her hands sinking into the sheets on both of her sides. "Does blowing off Reprieve's leg count as a good memory?" she then asked after a moment, while thoughtfully glancing at the almost scarily familiar room, the likes of which were probably all around them, all looking the same. The question caught James off guard a bit, and he paused for a moment as he looked at her slightly aghast. It wasn't exactly a topic he wanted to discuss all too much, and Shida knew that. For a moment, he wondered if she had simply taken her joking too far. However, as he looked into her face, he noticed the same thoughtful expression she had had earlier. "Jury's still out," James therefore replied, and reached for his breath filter, taking it off with a loud hiss before starting to walk over to Shida. "Are you going somewhere with that question?" Shida paused for a moment and glanced up at him, a small quiver in his yellow eyes, as they met his, indicating that she was seemingly contemplating something. However, seemingly gathering her determination, she blinked, and her pupils slightly constricted as she returned his gaze with a renewed firmness. It didn't last all that long, however, since she then closed her eyes and let herself fall backwards into the sheets. "It's that Laksha set from earlier," she practically announced, while lying on her back and staring up at the golden ceiling. "The cyborg or the scratching post?" James asked calmly in return, while slowly moving to sit down next to her, looking at her with mild concern. "The second one," Shida explained with a sigh. "I think he has those beauty marks from me." Seemingly subconsciously, her hand reached for her own scars on her right cheek as she said it. James blinked and leaned forwards onto his knees, while looking back at her. "You think?" he asked with an even voice, wondering how sure exactly she was of that. "I'm pretty sure, but it was a long time ago," she'd replied, her voice turning a bit more hesitant the longer she spoke. Now allowing himself to also fall backwards, James brought his face right next to hers and looked up alongside her. "You wanna talk about it?" he asked candidly, not looking to push her to do it, but wanting to be an open ear, in case she needed it. She'd have inhaled so deeply that James could see her chest slowly rise next to him without even needing to look. Then, she released all that air in one single exhale through her teeth, and the airstream hissed as it got cut apart by her sharp fangs. "I had forgotten about him, if I'm being honest. It was when I had just gone promoted to a shipman," she then explained, after another quicker breath, and one of her hands reached out to idly play with her hair as she spoke. "Back then I got a new supervisor for a while. Don't remember his name, only that he was a warrant officer and a primate. Working under him was irritating, but it was doable for the most part. But every now and then he had the oddest tasks for me. I don't remember many of them, only that he paraded me around a lot. That is, except for the last one." The hand playing with her hair now wandered down slightly, flatly laying itself onto her right eye, while the left kept lazily blinking upwards. "For that one we were on I think it was the GCS, and we went around collecting binders from a whole bunch of other warrant officers. Like real physical paper binders. I thought it was weird as hell." She then continued retelling her story, slowly, pausing briefly again as she came to this point. Her voice was a bit lower when she continued by saying, "Whatever they were, that Laksha said really wanted to get his hands on them. Threatened us with a gun and everything. I don't think he would have actually killed us over it these days, but back then I didn't think about that. I simply stopped him." Finally, she'd have pushed herself up into a sitting position. Noticing that, James quickly followed after her. She tilted her head to the side to rest it on his shoulder. "Must have gotten out of jail at some point during the last years," she mused in a mumble. "Looked like he recognized me." James furrowed his brow. That didn't sound good at all. "Think he's going to be out for revenge?" James figured with a worried tone, and reached to take her hand into his. She'd his ears flicked at his words, almost as if in curiosity. "Could be. Maybe. I don't know. Don't really think so," she explained, in a tone that almost sounded like she had not even thought about that as a possibility. Then, her eyes glanced straight up to James from his shoulder, with a bit of a spark behind him. "I mostly feel bad about it, I guess. Not because of what happened, I just defended myself, but I guess if I had cared more about what he wanted and why back then, maybe things would have gone differently." James, not quite thinking as quick on his feet as he usually did, tilted his head in confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked obliviously, to which she'd have put on a slightly unbelieving expression. Pushing herself off his shoulder, while keeping eye contact, she released a long breath through her nose. "James," she said, and her tone was almost pitiful. "Think about it. A bunch of warrant officers, some clearly weird and shady orders, and a Deathworlder who seemingly really wants to know what's going on with that. Does that ring a bell at all?" It did ring a bell, and admittedly James felt mightily silly about it, as his hand shot up to slap against his forehead. "Oh, shit," he mumbled. "Yup," she'd replied, popping her P sound. We should probably talk to that guy, shouldn't we?" James assumed, after taking a moment to recover from his own stupidity. She'd leaned her cheek onto one hand while she looked at him, her early expression of pity having not quite disappeared yet. "Think he'll even give us the time of day?" she wondered, with her eyebrows raised. "We don't seem to be exactly welcome here. And that's not even mentioning our shared past. James huffed slightly and shrugged, not sure about that himself. Worth a try, he mused aloud, while once again looking up to the ceiling. Maybe he still wants to know what's going on.